Question number 7, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Veterans Affairs. Will the government support families who want to repatriate the remains of family members buried in Malaysia who died while on deployment between 1956 and 1969? If not, why not?
The Honourable Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I respect the views of those families, but no, this government is continuing the policy of previous governments, most recently reconfirmed by that member's government in 2007.
Mr Speaker, supplementary
question. The Honourable Phil
What considerations does the government think should take precedence over the wishes of those families whose husbands, brothers and sons died while serving their country in Vietnam and in Malaysia, who want their remains brought home?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Craig Foss.
Mr Speaker, I'm sure those matters are the same as those that the previous government considered when it recently reviewed this policy and reconfirmed the policy which this government has picked up. There are many issues in and around this matter, Mr Speaker. There are many complex matters which I'm sure that member is aware of.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Phil
Mr
Goff.
Speaker, my question was what considerations should take precedence. I think the Minister is bound to give more than the same ones that somebody else did. I think he should be more specific.
Well, I'll hear from the Honourable Simon Bridges.
The member asked, as he said, what considerations, and then the Minister then went on to outline the same considerations as the previous government applied. That in itself was a full answer, but he then went on to also talk about a range of complex factors.
I think both members, I agree with the points made by the Minister in this case. I think that a question has been addressed.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, why, when the Australian government has offered to repatriate the remains of Australian soldiers who died in Malaysia and Vietnam and who are buried in Terendak in Malaysia, why is it not possible or appropriate for the New Zealand government to do the same thing for Kiwi soldiers buried there whose families desperately want them home?
The Honourable Craig.
Mr Speaker, yes, I became aware of the Australian initiative, in March this year. The Australians are absolutely able to do what they choose to do in their affairs. They did not recently review the matter themselves, as far as I understand it, as New Zealand recently reviewed the matter in 2007.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Given that the position of the RSA, which represents the interests of veterans, has changed since the government last considered this issue in 2007, and that they are now calling for a change of policy and a full review of the repatriation of those who were buried overseas, why won't he back the RSA's call for that review and for a change?
Mr Speaker,
Craig Foss.
Mr Speaker, I'm aware that when that member was interested in this issue and took papers to Cabinet in 2007, which are picked up by the Honourable Rick Barker, their points around the RSA point of view at the time was for the status quo. I'm not aware of any official change in the RSA's position, although I am aware that some members are considering it.
Point of order, the Honourable Phil Goff.
I seek the leave of the House to table 2 emails. One is from the RSA setting out their change in policy, and the second is from the Minister's own department asking for a copy of the RSA's change of policy. How he doesn't know, I don't know.
Order. Leave is sought to table those 2 emails. Is there any objection? There is not. They can be tabled.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Does he...
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he accept that if the government rejects the wishes of the families who want their loved ones brought home, its claims to honour the fallen veterans and their families on whom the burden of their loss fell most heavily will sound rather hollow to those families?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Craig Foss.
Mr Speaker, I take offence at that. Actually, I carry out my role and I carry the burden of this office and the respect to veterans and their families and the values that they stood and fought for this country very, very seriously, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Question number 8.